Good day, everyone. You're welcome back to this lecture series. And the topic before us today is sampling techniques. Before we go into this topic, I would like us to look at what we have discussed in the previous lesson, the previous lecture about population and samples. In that lecture, we're able to identify the fact that a population consists of the totality of a group of elements, of a group of units, of a group of entities that are of study interest. While we identify sample as a subset of this total group, as a subset of the entire population, as a group of selected elements or units from the population. And of course, we say, as opposed to sample, we have what we call a complete enumeration of the population, which we refer to as census. We're able to tell ourselves that if we decide to study the entire population where it is possible, we decide to go through the complete enumeration of the entire population. That is census. That will have been the best method of studying a particular population. But because of the many problems associated with census, such as time required, and of course the amount of energy, effort, and manpower it takes, as well as some of the errors it is likely to create due to data analysis and the lack of precision that we might fall into, we then prefer to go for samples where we are able to control some errors, to control the level of precision we like, and to get results out as quickly as possible. In that same lecture, we looked at the advantages and disadvantages of census as well as sample. We also identified the different kinds of population. And finally, we're able to understand that sample gives us an advantage instead of census. To properly position us into getting the full understanding of this particular lecture titled Sampling Techniques, here are some of the lesson objectives we hope to achieve at the end of this lecture. By the time you have finished watching this video, you should be able to mention the importance of proper sampling. That is, why is sampling so important? And how do we ensure that we take a proper sample that is truly representative or reflective of the population, such that when we generalize, it will be truly reflective of the characteristics of the entire population. We should also be able to mention the two major categories of sampling techniques. Another very important objective is that at the end of this video lecture, you should be able to mention and explain the various types of sampling techniques under each of the category we have identified. We should be able to use a table of random numbers to select a sample according to that technique. And of course, finally, we should be able to understand, mention, and explain the various advantages as well as disadvantages of the various sampling techniques we have identified. Having identified some of the objectives that we hope to achieve in this lecture, let us begin by looking at what exactly is sampling. Sampling, by definition, is the process of selecting a sample from the population. I take that again. I said it is the process of selecting a sample from the population. It is a process by which a relatively small number of individuals or measures of objects or events is selected and analyzed in order to find out something about the entire population from which that same sample is selected. Remember that whatever sample that we select from a population, it must be done, the selection must be done in such a way that whatever we find out from the sample should be generalizable on the population, on the entire population from which our sample is selected. Sampling helps us to reduce expenditure, save our time, and of course our energy, and they permit us measurement of greater scope as well as produce greater precision and accuracy. You see, what I'm trying to say here is that when we go for census rather than sampling, there is the risk of us running into enormous amounts of data depending on the size of the population, and that will waste our time, waste our money, do not give us the precision that we need because of errors, and of course will ultimately or might ultimately reduce our accuracy. These are some of the issues that sampling takes care of. In fact, scholars in various fields of studies, in sciences, social sciences, management sciences, and the rest of them, have come to agreement that it is simply not possible to collect data from every respondent relevant to our study, but only from some fractional part of the respondents. And that is sampling. The process of selecting a fractional part of the population is called sampling. It is an important technique. It's an important activity in carrying out a research study. and the place of sampling in the correctness, in the accuracy, in the validity and reliability of the findings of or the outcomes of any research cannot be overemphasized. So we can see that sampling is indeed very important. One key feature or one importance of sampling is that while we rely on only a fragment, a portion of the population, we want to understand the general characteristics of the population. And we want to be able to say for the entire population characteristics and features based on what we have discovered or found out from only a fragment of the population. It is therefore important that we ensure that in the process of selecting sample, we must not allow emotions or prejudices or bias in selecting our. So we must ensure proper sampling, that is, a very accurate and reliable process of taking sampling, because our outcome must be reflective of the entire population. And so our sample must also be truly representative of the entire population. In the same vein, the process of taking this truly representative sample, that is the sampling technique, must be carefully selected and properly implemented. It is very, very important. Let us now quickly look at the various sampling techniques that we have. Then we will look into each one of them in sufficient details and get basic understanding. First of all, let me disabuse our minds that one semester, one course may not be enough to gain mastery of all types of sampling techniques. But we may gain the mastery of a particular type, and probably, or let me say most definitely, basic understanding of all the various techniques. And that is what we are going to be aiming at, that we understand basically these various techniques of taking samples. Broadly speaking, sampling techniques can be categorized or can be grouped into two major categories. Number one is the probability sampling techniques, and the other one is the non-probability sampling techniques. As you can see from the image displayed, that we can further identify three types of sampling techniques that are probabilistic, and of course 3 types that are non-probabilistic. But the big question is, why do we refer to some as probability sampling and others as non-probability sampling? It is because of the method, the procedure adopted or used in selecting the samples. In more clearer terms, when you talk about the probability sampling, you will discover that the procedure of selecting a sample from the population or taking sampling units from the population are not based on the discretion of the researcher. No. They are based strictly on procedures such that every unit of a population has a known and fixed probability of being included in the sample. We're talking about taking a sample that is truly reflective. And we have talked about the fact that we should never allow prejudice, we should never allow bias in the process of sampling a population. So therefore, you can see that we must give every sampling unit, every entity, every individual in the population of concern a fair chance of being included in the sample, even though we know they all cannot be there, but they all should have a fair chance such that no one will be unjustly excluded. So when you use this kind of procedure that ensures that a fair chance is given to every sampling unit to be included, then the probability of every unit to be included is known and equal. Those types of procedures are known as probability sampling techniques. On the other hand, in the non-probability sampling, the units are selected most times at the discretion or the preference of the researcher. They depend on human judgment, convenience, availability, or some other human factors, depending on the situation that presents itself to the researcher. Here, some elements or some units of the population might be excluded or may not get a fair chance because it depends on the discretion, the judgment, the disposition of the researcher. But these are the two main categories of sampling techniques: the probability sampling techniques and the non-probability sampling techniques. They both have their advantages and disadvantages. It is not in all situations that non-probability sampling techniques is completely bad. And it is not in all situations that probability sampling techniques are completely the best. Let us take a quick look at the advantages of non-probability and probability sampling techniques. We begin with the probability sampling techniques. What are the advantages? One major advantage of probability sampling is that it is possible for us to make inferences about the entire population. And that is even the whole idea behind sampling to make inferences about the population. Number two advantage is that even if there are sampling errors, we have an increased chance of estimating accurately the sample errors that are made in the sampling. The third major advantage of probability sampling is that there is a higher level of reliability of research findings. Since we could rely on the findings or the outcomes of the research from this sample, then we can easily generalize whatever findings we have from the samples over the population. As far as we are sure that we have adopted the right sampling technique, the correct sample size, and have implemented this accurately, then we can be guaranteed that relying on such outcomes will not lead us into errors. The last but not the least advantage is that there is usually the absence of systematic error and sampling bias. Like I said, sampling bias is one key factor that could lead us or mislead us into taking wrong decisions. But once we are able to implement and use the correct sampling procedure by probability sampling, we limit the systematic error that could be committed, as well as we limit the possibility of shutting out important or certain elements of the population, which we call sampling bias. A quick look at the disadvantages of probability sampling. Number one, it is complex. It is very complex. It requires some level of expertise. It requires some level of professionalism as compared to non-probability sampling. That's number one. Number two, it is more time consuming because the process have to be taken through a very careful and systematic process that will take time as compared to non-probability sampling. The third one is that it is usually more expensive than the non-probability sampling. So those are some of the disadvantages of probability sampling. But then, let us quickly look at the advantages and disadvantages of non-probability sampling. A major advantage with non-probability sampling is that when compared to probability sampling, it is very cost and time effective. That means that when compared with probability sampling, one major advantage of non-probability sampling is that we can save time and we can save cost. It is also easy to use and can also be used when it is impossible to conduct probability sampling. So what we are trying to say here is that non-probability sampling is very easy to use, does not require expertise, does not require you to learn so many things. It is basic, it is simple, and easy to use. And it is an alternative when it is very difficult or impossible to carry out probability sampling, especially when you have a very small population to work with. On the flip side, the major disadvantage of non-probability sampling is that it is impossible to know how well your sample is representing the population. There could be introduction of bias, unfair and unjust shutting out of some elements of the population, added to the fact that we cannot calculate confidence intervals or margin of errors. So, it is always good or best practice to consider probability sampling methods. All right, now let us look at the various types of sampling under each of these two categories. As you can see again from this picture, under probability sampling, we have three major types: the simple random sampling, the stratified sampling, and the cluster sampling. While under the non-probability sampling, we have the purposive sampling, quota sampling, and convenience sampling. I'll make a quick run over all of these, albeit I'll be brief about them, hoping that you can read more about these ones on your own.